The Washington Post with new reporting that pro-Trump activists who say they're in coordination with the White House are circulating a draft executive order that would unlock extraordinary presidential power over voting. According to the paper, the draft order uses alleged Chinese interference in the 2020 election, which has been widely debunked. There's no evidence of that, as a basis to declare a national emergency that would give the president increased power over elections. A 2021 intelligence review concluded that China considered efforts to influence the election, but didn't go through with them. A Florida lawyer and longtime Trump associate who's advocating for that order told the Post the emergency would empower the president to ban mail ballots and voting machines as the vectors of foreign influence. He added he's had certain coordination with the White House and those officials, but declined to specify what he meant by that. The Post details sweeping changes listed in the proposed order, including requiring hand-marked and hand-counted paper ballots. A White House official told the paper the staff is regularly in communication with a variety of outside advocates who want to share their policy ideas with the president, but any speculation about his actions or announcements is just that, speculation. Meanwhile, MS Now has reporting on President Trump looking at whether he can issue an executive order that would require proof of citizenship for voter registration and photo ID to vote. According to a senior White House official, he's directed the White House counsel's office to look at this issue, despite his own lawyers warning this move could be unconstitutional and would face several legal challenges. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, the administration of elections belongs to states and localities, and any nationwide change to voting laws would have to pass through Congress, which does not seem unlikely. I want to bring in one of the authors of that report, MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard. I think, Vaughn, I'm struck by both your reporting with our colleague Jake Traylor and the way that the Post is now trying to revive debunked claims of Chinese election interference. Does that maybe explain why the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was in Fulton County? I mean, talk about your reporting and how all these various pieces fit together.
Allie, you're absolutely right. There are two tracks to this. And I think it's important when we talk about these two tracks that there is one that is effectively trying to appease the president in the form of what was a SAVE Act on Capitol Hill that now appears dead. The executive order that Jake and I are reporting about that the president has ordered his counsel to look into is something that would require proof of citizenship to register to vote, as well as identification in order to vote at polling locations around the country. Now, there's that, and then there is what the Washington Post is reporting about this draft proposal that some folks outside of the White House are trying to convince the president to take on. And it is so reminiscent of 2020 and the aftermath of his election loss, when folks like Michael Flynn and Sidney Powell came into the equation, and that draft executive order was prepared in which he would, if he had sought to do, try to seize voting machines. And so that's where the draft that we are reporting on is sort of the Susie Wiles, the White House staff approach to sort of saying, hey, President, here's a way to take this seriously. And then there's the outsiders. They want to go all in and really make a big play to change the outcome of these November elections.
Make a big play and defy the Constitution by allowing the president, through a sleight of hand mechanism on a national emergency, to overtake elections which are controlled by states and localities. I mean, I also want to drill down. I appreciate that you delineate between the two tracks, because this is yet another instance, I think, of White House officials trying to sanitize what the president is hearing from outside advocates and trying to say, OK, you want to do this? Let's just say voter ID. That's very much in the conservative orthodoxy. That makes sense. But can we drill down on who some of these outside advocates are? Because it's people like Cleta Mitchell and Steve Bannon, people who not just pressed elections conspiracy theories, helped to try to argue them unsuccessfully in courts in 2020, but are now very much not just outside of the White House. Some of these election deniers are being brought into key agencies now, too. So it's not just a theoretical election denialism thing anymore.
No, and this is where Donald Trump is still the one in charge.
Yeah.
And so Susie Wiles, James Blair, other political advisors in the White House can try to convince him to focus on the economy. But guess what? Donald Trump, at the State of the Union address, he's going to go off on a riff about saying the only way they can win is if they can cheat. Yeah. And that is where people like Steve Bannon are so well aware. All you have to do is send, based on our reporting, send some articles, documents over to top aide that will give it directly to the president, and this will continue to simmer for him, and he'll continue to talk about this. He made Kurt Olsen, this election denier, prominent election denier, who was at the forefront of working with Ken Paxton to try to overturn the 2020 election and allow state legislators legislatures to send their own electors to the courts. That man is now the special government employee that was working with the FBI to essentially move forward with that Fulton County investigation. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that Donald Trump is still going to do what he wants. And the idea of election fraud has been so at the forefront for him that the folks on the outside, people like Cleta Mitchell and Steve Bannon, they are well aware that they have exactly in office who they need in order to try to move forward with not only some of these past investigations that galvanize their base, but also call into question actions that could be taken not 7 months out from the midterms where we are now, but ultimately come hours or days before the midterm elections in ways that at that point could be too late for the courts to try to intervene.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think this is why people feel like there is serious foundation for fears about what could happen ahead of the November elections and the ways that this administration is already trying to say. You've got Steve Bannon saying, oh, we're going to send ICE to the polls. And then DHS apparently on a call yesterday saying, oh, no, we're not going to do that. And people don't trust what they're hearing because there is so much noise coming from election deniers and bad faith actors outside of government who do have exactly what you're talking about, the right inroads into the White House and to the president to get this information into his ear. And we've covered him long enough to know if you're the last person to talk to the president, there's a pretty good chance that what you say ends up being something that he echoes in a much more public forum. And when it comes to Ken Paxton, I know that he's going to Texas tonight. But when I was down in Texas, one of the key things that he was campaigning on was election denialism and the fact that Democrats somehow cheated in the election. And so more of these election deniers are coming into Congress than ever before.
And we have watched them be willing to challenge the constitutionality of what is clear in federal law. And also, under the current federal law, there is no statute that allows the president to declare a national emergency as it pertains to elections. Again, though, that doesn't mean that they haven't tried to find ways to use the federal law in order to move forward with what exactly the president wants to do.
Yeah, I know you're going to stay on this. MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, great reporting. Thank you for coming on and talking about it with us.